What comes to mind when I say Cinderella, Snow White, and Little Red Riding Hood? Probably Disney. But actually, these tales that we know and love originated in Germany during the early 19th century. Two brothers by the names of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm are the ones that we should be thanking for these iconic childhood tales. Their published work even inspired the early stories of one of the greatest animators and filmmakers of all time, Walt Disney, who popularized the fairy tales that we grew up with in American media and literature. These stories have been around for ages. They are classics that almost everyone has heard. They are loved by millions and justly so. Who doesn't love a good romance? Who doesn't love a good adventure? Who doesn't love a happy ending? Most people do, which is why these stories of trials and triumph are so appealing. They offer a glimpse of hope to children and adults, and they are a universal sign of hope, happiness, and love. The stories provide a life lesson that can come from places we least expect it to. We may never know what in life will help us and what will hurt us, but these stories help us realize that there is hope even in the worst situations. But this is just based off the American Disney-fied version that we all know well today. So let's rewind. Who were the Brothers Grimm and what are their stories? The Brothers Grimm were German librarians who specialized in philology, the study of language and historical texts. During the early 19th century, they became quite interested in cultural research and began collecting and publishing the local folklore. The two brothers sought to collect stories that would demonstrate the purity and the antiquity of the German folk. These stories were meant to bind the German-speaking people together and to show that they spoke for the oldest roots of humanity. So actually, the Brothers Grimm didn't even write any of the stories that their name has become synonymous with. Instead, these stories existed as a part of a long-standing oral tradition in Germany and have been passed down through generations for many years. The brothers interviewed friends, relatives, and the local townspeople, and eventually published in 1812 the collection of folklore and fairy tales as Children's and Household Tales. The stories in the collections have been translated into more than 160 different languages, and the individual fables and fairy tales are so timeless that each language can have several different versions. For example, the United States has more than 120 different editions alone. Now, the stories that we know have been Disney-fied, meaning meant for kids, and everything and everyone always lives happily ever after in the end. But that's not exactly how these stories were originally meant to be told. The earliest editions of the Grimm's fairy tales did not contain any illustrations and were mainly targeted at adults. They contained violence and dark content definitely not meant for the eyes of children. The brothers sought to study the German language, culture, and the people, and while the phrasing of the stories is entirely of their own invention, it is in all cases in a popular form of German and in a lower register of writing intended to match the style of the oral sources from which they were originally collected. Now let's look at three well-known fairy tales and how they've changed from their original stories. First up, Cinderella. We all know the basic story. A girl is a lowly servant with some ugly evil stepsisters who gets a visit from some magical being who makes her dream of marrying the prince come true. There have been several American film versions of these tales, from the original Disney animated Cinderella in 1950 through Ella Enchanted in 2004 to the new Disney live-action Cinderella in 2015. Don't forget all about those Cinderella story movies too, but the main plot is always pretty much standard. A girl rises up despite her obstacles and gets her prince. In contrast to the Disney's version of the age-old story, the original Grimm's version, Ashbuto, is a bit more violent, especially where the stepsisters are involved. In an attempt to convince the prince that each is the sought glass slipper wearer, they both gruesomely chop off parts of their feet to fit the shoe. Also, the stepsisters at one point want so badly to get reflected glory of Cinderella's wedding that they try to accompany her down the aisle, at which Cinderella's lovely bird friends violently peck their eyes out. The Cinderella story is popular across many cultures, and academics have managed to track down around 350 versions of the story alone, both written and spoken. The Disney rendition of the tale is far happier and hopeful than the latter. Goodness and kindness always prevails, and the child readers are inspired to never give up on their dreams, for through hard work and good intentions, anything is possible. So Walt and his team probably made the right call in making those edits before showing their child audience. So next we have Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Who would have thought that the story of a wicked queen, a princess, 7 dwarves, and an apple could have kick-started the legacy of one of the biggest animation studios of all time? Nobody, and not only did Walt Disney have to mortgage both his house and studio to finance the production, but pretty much every single critic doubted that anyone would willingly pay to watch a feature-length cartoon about 7 little hairy men. I'd say they were quite wrong, seeing as though the film went on to inspire several foreign filmmakers and threw open the doors to an entire industry of animated films in the West. Today, the American film industry has adapted the tale of Snow White to several successful films and TV series, including Snow White and the Huntsman in 2012, Mirror Mirror in 2012, and Sydney White in 2007. In the 1857 German version of Snow White, the stepmother does not ask the huntsman to bring her Snow's heart. Instead, she asks for her lungs and liver. Snow White has to beg and plead the huntsman to spare her life. Rather than in the Disney version, he feels guilty and decides to trick the queen on his own sense. When the hunter fools the queen by bringing her back the lungs and liver of a young boar, she instead boils them in salt and actually eats them. Both the American and the original Grimm's tale incorporate the poisonous apple bit, yet the Germans don't believe in true love's kiss in this case. The dwarves are actually unable to revive Snow after she falls dead after taking the bite, so they put her in a glass coffin, embossed with her name and birth. Many years later, a prince comes to the house and sees the dead girl, and he falls in love with her. He asks to buy the girl from the dwarves, but they refuse. He tells them that he will die if he can't see her every day for the rest of his life. As his servants are carrying her home, they actually drop her coffin, and the jolt effectively performs the Heimlich maneuver on Snow White. A chunk of the poisoned apple comes flying out of her mouth and she returns to life. Disney had a bit of a more romantic outlook on the Snow White tale. Like previously mentioned, the huntsman in the Americanized version shows compassion towards Snow and doesn't steal her heart. Also, the dwarves in the Disney rendition add much excitement and spirit to the film itself. Some say that they are actually the heart and the soul of the film, but in the original German tale, the dwarves are not individually introduced and their personalities aren't even developed. Walt Disney chose to romanticize the tale and incorporate powerful moral lessons into the plot. What we learn here is that happiness and positivity can make a difference. Be selfless and compassionate and care for others like you would like to be cared for, because you never know the impact that your kindness can have on one another. Personally, I prefer the magic and the romanticism in the Disney version, but that's just me. Lastly, we go to Little Red Riding Hood. Other than the Disney shorts, Little Red Riding Hood has been adapted into several films, animations, games, musicals, and television shows. For example, Little Red makes an appearance in Shrek 2 in 2004, The Big Bad Wolf, which was released in 1934 as a part of the Silly Symphony series, Hoodwinked in 2005, Into the Woods in 1987, and Red Riding Hood, along with Snow White, Pinocchio, and several other fairy tale characters, appear in recurring roles in ABC's wildly popular and successful Once Upon a Time TV series and NBC's Grimm. Although the exact tale of Little Red Riding Hood may not be portrayed in each adaptation, they were all nonetheless inspired by the same foundational plot set forth in the Grimm brothers' children and household tales. Let's recap. Little Red Riding Hood goes on a journey through the woods to grandmother's house with some freshly baked cookies in her basket. As she makes her way through the woods, the big bad wolf secretly stalks her for a while. He poses as Red's grandmother in bed. Cue the iconic dialogue. Goodness, what big eyes you have, the better to see you with. What a deep voice you have, the better to greet you with. And what big hands you have, the better to hug you with. What a big mouth you have, the better to eat you with. Then panic ensues, but in the end, Little Red escapes and all is well. But in the Brothers Grimm original published version, contrived from Charles Perrault in 1697, Little Red actually strips naked, gets in bed, and then dies because she is eaten by the big bad wolf, with no miraculous relief. In another well-known version, Red eats her own grandmother only to have her own flesh then cooked up and her blood poured into a wine glass by our wolfish friend. As you can see, Little Red Riding Hood is not supposed to have such a positive conclusion. But can you imagine those versions being put into American children's book growing up? I can see why Disney decided to make a few tweaks back in 1922 when it published its first short cartoon rendition of the classic tale. In this early 20th century American rendition, Disney incorporates the story of the three little pigs who also have a run-in with the big bad wolf. Little Red and two of the pigs decide to take a shortcut through the woods. They meet the wolf, the pigs run away, but Red continues to Grandma's home. There, they have the iconic meeting. Red figures out who she is actually speaking to, panic ensues, but in the end, Grandma and Red are both victorious over the big bad wolf. This is all wrapped up in the main idea and moral lesson of the story. Be careful who you trust. Trust your instincts and listen to the advice of your elders. They may be onto something. Now, whether it was Disney or the classic Brothers Grimm, these once-upon-a-time stories have been around for ages and are loved by many. Contemporary American literature has transformed and adapted the original stories to create both entertaining and educational tales that contain important and extremely valuable life lessons that children growing up can absolutely benefit from being exposed to. Translations and revisions of the original stories are continually being made, which in turn broadens the reach of these tales and increases the possibility of these classic stories reaching more people all around the world. In American society, we have adapted these stories to lead to a happy ending. We value the importance of children knowing early on that while life may have its twists and turns, the possibility for a better future is always there. In our stories, there are no gray areas. We know what is supposed to be evil and what is supposed to be good, which are simple features helpful to a growing adolescent. Compared to the original German tales, the American renditions of these stories are more focused on the life lessons and the morals that can be learned from the characters' adventures. Today's fairy tales open a world of fantasy, adventure, and magic to both children and adults. Without globalization, the intersection of German culture with American society, our favorite fairy tales may not even have been possible. As you can see, there is much more to these stories than meets the eye, and the more that we explore and learn about their origins and foundations, the better we are able to understand how powerful the impact of globalization is on contemporary culture.